us and how to take action on empowering women in the workforce is absolutely critical. And so we are particularly happy because we have a number of very, very impressive speakers today with a variety of backgrounds who bring different perspectives to bear that are particularly relevant for India as well as around the world. And as a government, as a country, we firmly believe that it is impossible for any country to reach its potential if women are not empowered, both economically in terms of their own individual status, but also in terms of their ability to participate in all facets of society. So it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists and our moderator. We have Asma Khan, an Indian-born British chef, restaurateur, and cookbook author. Amita Nigam, the co-founder of the Women in Work and Health Initiative in New Delhi. Also, Namita Waikar, the author of the novel The Long March, as well as the managing editor of the People's Archive of Rural India. And Anuradha Bhagwati, writer, activist, and U.S. Marine Corps veteran, whose book Unbecoming, a Memoir of Disobedience, I found particularly powerful, and I'm particularly proud because it's great for us to bring Americans here, but someone who also helps tell a story of the ability of women to do things that are extremely non-traditional, joining the Marine Corps, and then leading the charge so that women would be allowed into combat roles in the Marine Corps. And so we're very, very proud to have this panel. And then we have an excellent moderator, Namita Bhandare, a Delhi-based journalist and columnist who writes on women's issues at the Hindustan Times. So please join me in giving them a big round of applause. Thank you very much.
Are we playing the clip? I hope that short clip has energized everybody this morning because I have fabulous women with me. And to be honest, it's a little intimidating and has been a bit of a challenge just to think about how to weave this all together because you have here such a diverse range of talent from a US Army Marine to a celebrity chef. I hope that's not an offensive word, celebrity chef, yeah. To a social entrepreneur and the chronicler of the stories of rural women that we rarely hear or see in India. So one thing these women do have in common is that they are all groundbreakers, breaking stereotypes, redefining the meaning of women's work. So what is women's work? How do we define it? We know that Oxfam has released a report this week which talks about women's work, but this is work that is never paid, is never recognized, gets no time off, gets no rights, no bonus, no overtime, and this is the business of chopping, cooking, cleaning, looking after children, looking after the elderly, looking after the disabled, in many parts of India, fetching firewood, water, fodder. And one report says that women spend on an average of 6 hours a day on this work. Men, if you want it in perspective, spend about 51 minutes a day, usually to fetch water or to go to the market and buy things. And so, is this women's work? It's unrecognized. Nobody recognizes it. And very often when I talk about unpaid women's work, people say, well, should women be paid for this work? And no, I'm not saying necessarily that women should be paid for this work, though that is something to consider, but the modalities of how and when. But let's park that idea for now. But surely we can recognize that work. And surely we can recognize this huge gender gap in that work, which, as the Oxfam report points out, is one of the greatest contributors to inequality and poverty, gendered poverty. What is gender? If women spend 6 hours a day working in the house, they do not have the time to work outside the house. And work outside the house is paid work. Is that right? So, Namita, since we started with the clip, I'm going to start with you. Can you tell us a little about the clip and tell us a little about the work you do? I'll give you my mic.
Yeah, hi. Thank you all for being here. I would like to thank JLF for having this session. I'll talk about the People's Archive of Rural India. The clip that you just saw, it's about, the first one was 2 young women from a school in rural India in Kanchipuram district in Tamil Nadu. And they learn theatre, and it's a residential school. Now, Mridangam, the instrument which they were playing, that's usually something that's played by men. But in this school, they challenge these roles and they teach men, the girls and the boys, to do all kinds of roles. So they were playing the Mridangam. The second one is the women playing drums. That was a group of women in rural Bihar who decided to do something which is not expected of them. They formed a band, and right now that Mahila band is in great demand, and I hear people schedule their weddings based on the availability of their dates. So in rural India, we have women working for several hours, and about 80% of rural women depend on agriculture, but they don't own the land. Just about up to 13% of women have ownership of land, which means they don't have access to credit from the banks. They don't have access to the rights that they would get if they were the owners of the land. And they are at the receiving end of a lot of discrimination and ill treatment from officials as well as money lenders, etc., and the other men in the village when it comes to that.
Right. Namita, we're going to talk about roadblocks and the routine harassment that women face, but I first want to get everybody in. Asma, let's talk about the work you do. You, on one hand, what you do is very traditional. I mean, nothing can be more traditional than cooking, but cooking as a professional is a different kettle of fish, right? So what is it like for you as a woman of color to be in this very male profession, dominated, and in a society dominated by white men?
It is a challenge, but I think that, I wasn't intimidated, because for me it was very, very important to, put the flag in the sand so that people would understand that, even though it was very rare, especially, in Indian restaurants, you never see women. You might see the occasional woman, I'm talking about in England, you might see the occasional woman as a pastry chef in the cold kitchen because, she can do the delicate work. You never see them in front of the fire. And the whole idea that, in every household you go to, in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, you will find invariably a woman cooking. But the moment it is about paid work, it is seen as being responsible. We are nowhere there. And when I wanted to do it, when I wanted to actually cook, there was nobody who looked like me. And you cannot be what you cannot see. And I saw myself, I dreamt it, I willed it, that I was going to open a space for women. Because see, I had a PhD in law, I'm a lawyer, and everyone said, oh yeah, you're going to break the glass ceiling. I'm not interested in breaking the glass ceiling. For me, I needed to bring the edifice down. I wanted to break it down, level it, so that all that space could be occupied by women who felt marginalized, who felt othered, who felt different. And it's, complicated in the business that I am in hospitality, that there's a lot of abuse, and, we haven't had our Me Too moment or Me Too movement. So, it's even harder when you are a woman of color, because the first abuse is often racial, and then it becomes sexual, and then it is physical. So there's a gradual process, but everyone I've spoken to has always said it's always the color of your skin on which they pick you on first, and then as a woman. It's not easy, but our success story, we're the Michelin Guide, yes, I don't know how many of you have seen it, we're on Netflix. We were picked as the first British chef. I was expecting a backlash from a lot of people on Twitter saying, oh, you're not very British looking, you don't sound British, your food is not British. Not a single tweet. And that says change has happened. Because even though someone may have wanted to say that on Twitter, even the anonymous people, the trolls, didn't say that to me. Because my attitude is, watch me fly, I'm here. You take my food, you better take me too. Because you can't just have chicken tikka masala as the UK's favorite dish and then not want me. No, you take me too. And the other thing is, you stayed long enough in my country. You stayed 200 years in my country. So I think it's okay. I can be there for a while now. It's fine.
Good for you, Asma. Would you tend to agree, Anu? Did you encounter racism? And you are talking about the US military, which is very macho, which is very male. Did you encounter any kind of racism and sexism, and how did you deal with it?
Yeah, so thanks
how did you land up there in the first place?
For having us. Yeah, well, that's a long story, how I ended up in the Marines. It has a lot to do with my family. My family's Gujarati, but immigrated to the States in the 50s and 60s. And I was a very rebellious, adventurous child, and also suffering through the ABCD complex, being an American born confused Desi, not knowing if I was Indian or American. America has such a dysfunction over race, but the conversation, as limited as it is really about black and white, and where does brown fit into that? I'm still not sure. And so being a brown Indian girl, daughter of immigrants in New York City, I didn't know who I was. And that question of identity and not belonging and being bullied because I was brown really formed my identity as a teenager. And I had a bit of a controlling father. He could be a bully at times, and they were both academics, so I was under this intense academic pressure to succeed, go to the best schools. And it was too much for me, and I rebelled eventually against my controlling family and joined the Marines, which is a very controlling institution. It's actually much more controlling than my father could ever be. But yes, I faced intense sexism. The Marine Corps is still not a place that is welcoming of women. It's the fiercest branch of the military. It's the most physical. It's the most masculine. It's the most misogynistic, the most racist, the most homophobic, all of the best in the world. And so, you really had to fight to be respected, work twice as hard. And for me, I have these intersectional identities. I also identify as queer or bisexual. And so, any element of my identity was under scrutiny. Could have been kicked out at the time for being bisexual, by the way, under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was the policy. But mostly, I was a woman, right? And then a woman of color. And so I had to really fight. And what I ended up doing was fighting for my fellow women in the Marine Corps. And only 6 to 7% of the Marine Corps was female at the time. So a really tiny percentage. You sort of stuck out like a sore thumb. Now, it's really the same. And the Marine Corps has very little desire to integrate more women. As the DCM mentioned, we ended up suing the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, to open up combat assignments to women. And that's one of the reasons there were so few women in the Marines and the military at large, is because these combat assignments were just off limits to women. Even if you were stronger than the man next to you and you could do more physically as well as mentally, you just could not try out for these jobs like infantry or special forces. And we thought, this is ridiculous. This is a bad way of running a business. It's not a meritocracy. You don't have your best and your brightest in these positions. So make it a level playing field, open up the jobs, and see who applies for them, see who wants to go to these schools. And sure enough, when we lifted that ban, women flooded into these schools. And now you have In the Army, you have infantry officers who are women. You have women who are trying out for the Navy SEALs. It's fantastic. It's a very exciting time to be a servicewoman in the United States.
Great. So women, work and identity. Yeah, I just want to pick up from what Anu said about identity. And I think for a lot of us and a lot of women in India who tend to be homebound, who tend to be within the four walls, work outside is also about recognition. It's about who I am. What have you encountered? What is your experience there?
Thank you, Namita, for that question. And before I answer that, I would just like to congratulate the audience because it is very well represented. And in my experience, whenever there's an issue called women, work, and their health, or anything related to women, it is normally 80 to 90% women in the audience. So this is, I think, great tribute to the organizers and to the audience. Thank you. So I would like to actually talk about the falling rate of women in the labor force, particularly in the context of India. The figures are appalling. According to the last NSSO, which has also been reported by the World Bank, we are actually 121 out of 131 countries. The countries which are worse than us in Asia, the country is only Pakistan and Afghanistan. And the rest, of course, Saudi Arabia and some other countries like that. What does it say about our country? And I attribute it to the Global Gender Gap Index, where we are 108 out of 144 countries. So according to me, everything that we talk about regarding work, women's work, unpaid work, women working outside of the house, is related directly to the gender indices in our country. And that is what we need to address. Whether it be childcare, whether it be patriarchy, whether it be the kind of, the pride that families have in keeping their daughters-in-law and their daughters out of the workforce, because that increases their status. And there are some peculiar instances of this. Only the other day, I met a girl, a youngish, 30-year-old something, working in an embassy, and she's a postgraduate, and she's not getting married. Now, this is a question which is all the time asked of young unmarried women of a certain age in India. A certain age means anybody above 25. So why aren't you married? And why is she not getting married? Because all the places where she's getting this rishta, this arranged marriage proposal, or even whatever, one of the conditions is that we don't want you to work. We're so happy that you're so qualified and you're so educated, but we have the money. So what do you need to work for? You see, because if you can keep your daughter-in-law out of the workforce and she is looking after, cooking, supervising, whatever.
Basically slave labor.
And care work, which is not at all attributed to, our GDP. And therefore, if we have any dreams of, having that 5 trillion whatever economy, keeping your half the workforce out, the women out of the workforce, where can this dream ever be realized? And for that, I think a whole lot of factors need to be taken care of, and we will expand on this as Namita goes.
Right, but what I was trying to get at was work, paid work, as not just an escape from the claustrophobia that families can sometimes impose, especially in our society, but also as a means of self-expression and identity. Asma, you experienced some of that, right? When you started cooking, it was an escape. Can you tell us about it a little?
For me, I started cooking because I found moving, I had an arranged marriage. I married someone who obviously I didn't know at all. And, everyone in my family was super excited. He was a gold medalist from Oxford, a professor at Cambridge University. And, everyone's like, wow, you're so lucky. A very liberal, progressive man. But the thing is that the isolation of being an immigrant really hits you hard when you move to a place like Cambridge, where if you're not a student and you're not an academic, you're nobody. And my husband just told me that I'm an academic, I teach at the home. You can't go and talk to anyone who's Asian because I don't want you to bring them home. He was admissions tutor, graduate tutor, all the papers in the house were there. So basically he told me I can't talk to anyone because I was too awkward and embarrassed to talk to anyone who was not Indian. Because I'd never been outside this country. I was absolutely terrified of people who looked different from me. I was embarrassed and shy. I was acutely shy. And dressed in my shalwar kameez with my chappals. I didn't even have proper winter clothes because I was wearing my trousseau. My mother had prepared a trousseau for someone who was going to marry in the royal family. The fact that no one in the royal family wanted to marry me, she hadn't worked that out. So I ended up marrying just an academic, very progressive academic. But the clothes I had was all my beautiful silkenware with, hand-stitched shoes. So it was very, very hard. And I felt very isolated. And I found that cooking was my way home. Because for that moment that I had the aromas of the bhuna, meat, and I was making this roti, and when the ghee burnt the edge of the paratha, I literally felt the presence of my mother next to me. And, I'm talking about 3 decades ago. There was no internet, there was no mobile phone. I could make a 3-minute timed call to my mother. But the entire time she said, "Beta, how are you?" She asked me how I am. And she didn't even give me the space to say that, so I could tell her I was so lonely. And I was really scared that they would think that I was having a miserable marriage. My husband was very nice to me. He was just didn't talk to me. And it was just one of those things where, food became my identity, food became my way home. And I realized that when I ate, for that moment, I went home. Away from all this cold, grey, freezing cold Cambridge, I was sitting in my mother's angan, in the courtyard, eating. And I thought, not only now that I know this is a way of getting home, I'm going to make sure that I feed other people. And irrespective of which culture they come from, they can taste food cooked by love and patience. And for that moment, I take them home too. And this is why I started the food business behind my husband's back in my house. I used to do supper clubs. I didn't have the money. But of course, I didn't take up the job after my PhD. So, I was too embarrassed then to ask him, I want to do something else with food. He'd kill me. He'd tell me, "You're mad. You want to be a cook." And so, for me, food was about power. Food was about politics. And as an immigrant, I realized one thing. Too much of our cuisine was being appropriated by others. And it was that, there was no recognition and no celebration of women who cooked. Home cooks were considered to be nothing and nobody. And I never saw anyone. Now there are home cooks in England who come to my restaurant saying, I started a little food business, a dabba business, a food business. When I was there was nobody who looked like me, who spoke like me, who did food. But for me, this was about asserting my right to be in that country, but also using my identity to use food as a way of communicating with my host country, a bridge to the people who I could not access, but through food, I could get their attention and I could communicate through them.
Right. Namita, work as assertion, paid work. I mean, I shouldn't say work because all women work, whether we recognize that as work or not. And I remember a woman in a steel factory in Haryana telling me about her day, how she wakes up at 5 a.m., she heats the milk for her daughter, then she prepares the lunch, then she packs a dabba for her husband, and then she packs a dabba for herself, washes the utensils, does the clothes, has a bath, and runs to work. And she said, it's a very hard life. And I said, why are you doing it? So she says, I'm doing it because it makes me feel like someone. So do you get that a lot from the women you talk to in smaller towns, in rural India?
Yeah, definitely. The women in rural India, they have the kind of spunk that you wouldn't expect because you take them for granted. About 70% of India lives in the villages. And I'm going to talk about these Anganwadi workers and Asha workers. Anganwadi workers are the women who take care of toddlers up to the age of 6 years. And in India, about 35 to 60% of children of that age group, they go to these Anganwadis. And the women who take care of them, they've finished their basic schooling. And they take care of everything. They cook lunch for them. They take care of them. They also take care of some pregnant and lactating women. They see that the parents of these children fill up the requisite forms for healthcare services, etc. and they get paid an honorarium, which means they don't get a salary, they don't get benefits, and they also don't get paid on time. And the
How
amount...
many hours do they work?
They work from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m.
Okay, so
and they get only about 10,000 rupees, which means that they need to do a second job if they want to, make do for their families. And the other thing is about the Asha workers, who are the workers in the primary healthcare business, primary healthcare in the villages. One Asha worker would take care of about at least 1,000 people in rural India. And she goes from village to village, taking care of their health, making sure that the children are getting the inoculations and medications, etc., taking care of the elderly. And also, she is involved in helping the government with surveys, filling up forms, etc. Even the Asha workers get only an honorarium, and very often they don't get paid on time. And their payment is also linked to the amount of work they do, the amount of forms they get filled, the amount of inoculations they get done, and vaccinations they get done. And yet, they do it because they love the people that they work for. They want to make sure that every person they work with in the villages is healthy and get as much facilities as they can provide. And they still feel proud of their work in spite of not getting paid what they deserve.
So really what you're describing is actually an economy that is vastly dependent on the underpaid work of women. This is
Right.
an army of women, propping up the economy and doing work that would, if a man was probably doing, they would be paid proper government wages.
Oh yeah, they would probably have awards and they would be felicitated.
Yeah. So, one of the interesting findings in women and work in India is that even with unpaid care work, there is a division. So, the largest demographic that does unpaid work are widowed women. They do the most work. And the category of women that does the least work are divorced women. And similarly, in terms of paid work, single women tend to stick on to the work, to jobs and to the workplace much more. So marriage is really a bump, and motherhood is definitely a bump. Is that the same in America? The roadblocks in terms of marriage and motherhood?
Well, I can speak to a few things. Certainly, one of the interesting things about the U.S. military is, regardless if you're a man or a woman, you're black or white, you're going to get the same salary. Whatever your rank is, you will get the same salary as the next person, right? So unlike in the civilian workforce, where if you're a white woman, you'll get a little less than men. If you're a black woman, you'll get a lot less than men in terms of your salary. So there's discrepancy across not just gender, but also race, which is really important. So if you're a woman of color, regardless of the sector you're in the United States, you will be earning less than men, and certainly white men. This society is rapidly changing. I mean, I listened to Elizabeth Gilbert's talk yesterday. I was on the edge of my seat. Certainly, more women are choosing to be single in the United States, and proudly so, as they are in India. My mother actually, I can answer this by telling a personal story, actually married and divorced an abusive husband in the 50s and 60s in India. She was from Surat, she was from Gujarat, and so came from a very traditional family. So this is obviously considered radical in the Indian society, maybe a little less radical in American society. But to choose to divorce an abusive husband is a radical act still for a woman. To choose to not get married at all is a radical act. But more young women are choosing this now, and my mother certainly was a pioneer in that regard. And I think you're seeing this all over the world, really, that women are choosing their own paths, and that their relationship to men, both privately and professionally, directly contributes to their lack of opportunity.
Yeah, well, part of the problem is also the way women are brought up. and this is particularly true for India, but it's also true for all over the world. And I was at a session yesterday where somebody made the comment. It said that, is your character, female character, is she likable? And she says, women fuss too much about this issue, about being likable. We're obsessed with it. Is she likable? Are you a pleasant co-worker? Nobody asks that about a man. It's okay if men are aggressive and everything else, but, are you likable? Are you nice? And we're brought up to be nice, and we don't, therefore, speak up enough. And do you find this changing in India, amongst younger women particularly?
That's a very interesting question that you've asked, Namita, because I firmly believe from what I've been seeing and in my interviews and the surveys that we have conducted, both amongst the economically underprivileged sections of society, and in this case, it's across Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Sangam Vihar, which is one of the largest unauthorized colonies in Delhi. So the social indoctrination process is very much a part of it. Women are brought up to be good, nice, likable. Also, which is a big thing in India, is to be able to adjust. Adjust to your parents, adjust to your father in particular, your brother, your whatever male colleagues. And later, of course, which is the big sword hanging on most women's heads, particularly the young ones, is when you get married, then you must adjust to your in-laws' house. Because of all kinds of, processes which are involved with it, and, the stigmatization of, a girl, divorce, which you have just alluded to. Though, of course, it is very much on the rise. But I think, what we can actually take a lot of encouragement from is also surveys that we have done with the younger, if I may say so, across the board, both the underprivileged and also from the economically privileged sections of society. And this is an age group of, from the 25 to the 35 age group. And if you ask them, so what is your attitude to work? And they want to work as a self-actualization process, to have their own money, to be able to spend the way they wish to. Also, because I think, there is this media build-up of, wearing the right clothes, doing the right things, going for cafe coffee day, for instance. If you don't have your own money, how do you do it? And also, I think, the barriers between the sexes, to some extent, is also coming down. So whether, you hide it from your parents and your elders, but if you can steal that cup of coffee, it is a kind of a whole lifestyle aspiration with perhaps your boyfriend on the sly. And this is something which is also very interesting. In the research that we have done, there are a lot of women from, say, the upper caste actually having love involvement. I'll not use the word affair because I think that's a little derogatory, with the so-called Dalit classes or, castes which are lower. And in that sense, it is, I think it's very encouraging for India, the kind of changes that we are having and taking place. And yes.
Yeah, so we talk a lot about this generation of girls in India being the most aspirational ever. And, Nanni Kali had this report that showed 70% of the teenage girls they interviewed across the country said they wanted careers before marriage. Whether these dreams will actually be actualized or realized depends, of course, on the fathers and the brothers and the husbands. But do you see men changing? Are boys changing? Because if boys don't change, it's very difficult for girls to do it alone.
Yeah, I think boys also do change. I'll talk about one particular story that I've recently done. It's yet to be published on Pari. It's a family in a semi-rural town called Bhuj in Kutch, Gujarat. And it's a family that has 4 girls and 2 boys, the children. And the parents are not educated, they are not even literate. The mother works as a cook in restaurants or in wedding functions. And the father works as a worker to, to construct these kind of pandals for functions and weddings. And the mother proudly says that, and the father, that we are not educated, but we wanted to educate our children. So they've put all these children through school, and they want to make sure they all do something which they could not do. And the eldest daughter, she's finished her 10th class, and she decided to become an auto rickshaw driver. In Kutch, they call it the chakda. It's a large auto rickshaw, and she's the first young woman in Kutch to drive an auto rickshaw. And her other sisters are also studying. One is doing a computer science course in a technology institute. The others are in school. But they want to make sure that they all work. And the boys are also, they kind of look up to their sisters to do something that their sisters have done. So I think there is a change. And I think it's starting more from what we call the lower classes and lower castes rather than the upper castes who tend to be more conservative.
Yeah, and women's honor and shame and all the things that Amita talked about. So I know somebody once told me, you're talking about this woman auto rickshaw driver, but in Delhi, which is the capital of India, there is all of one woman who drives the DTC buses. And someone told me why, and they said because the buses are designed, they come from abroad, we're importing the bodies, and you have to be at least 5'7" to be able to drive those buses, because that's the height you need so that your feet reach the pedals. And there are not very many Indian women who are 5'7". So it's a structural flaw and something so simple, because men are deciding, some man has decided to import these buses without considering whether they can be adapted for women. It's not that women can't drive buses or don't want to drive buses, but actually they can't drive these buses. So there is, I feel sometimes, with the workplace as well, Asma, there is a design flaw. It's not that women don't want to work, but women want to work on very different terms, because they need to get home to feed the children, or they want to be home in the evening. They don't want to go to off-sites and do all these male bonding exercises so beloved of corporate India.
Yeah, the thing is that my argument with the hospitality industry is that they have set up the rhetoric and also the rota system and a military form of hierarchy in the kitchen, which has been designed to exclude women. Because, and I say this to a lot of male chefs, and I tell them, this is not brain surgery. You're just peeling potatoes. So why can't we have two shifts? You have one shift where they come and they leave at 2 o'clock. We can go and pick up their kids. So 3 o'clock is a hallowed hour. 3:30 kids get over from school. So they can go, and then somebody can come back at 4 o'clock. It's not that someone is dying on the operating theater. But everybody makes it feel like, no, they want to see it through. This is a male ego thing. And this excludes us. Because if all you're doing is peeling potatoes or you're frying something, you stop, you go, someone else will come and fry it. Why do you need to see it till the end of service? Why must your hours be from darkness to darkness? In England, for every chef, they come in at 6 o'clock, it's dark. They leave after midnight, it's dark. You don't see daylight, and my God, that shows in their mental health. Because, and often the argument that is given by a lot of men of why they abuse women is because of stress. And I tell them, and I say this to everyone, and I'm fearless, and I've recently had an argument with Heston Blumenthal, who's a superstar. But I think that his comment about pregnant women was totally unacceptable. He said that, we don't want pregnant women in our restaurant because they cannot pick up heavy pots. And I was like, whoa. So I wrote a huge article in the newspaper. Sadly, no other female chef wanted to comment on it. I said, really? If, we have pregnant women in our restaurant, somebody else picks up the pot. And what kind of a restaurant are you running where you have to keep lifting pots the whole day? It is not. And on a London underground, a pregnant woman gets on, somebody will get up. It's just about humanity and decency. And this whole rota system, we sit with the tube map, we mark out where everybody stays, how long it gets them to go home. At 8 o'clock, and everyone sees, and I love this, that our guests cheer the women as they leave. They leave like Noah's Ark, 2 by 2. So the women at 8 o'clock, those who live furthest away, leave at 8 o'clock, even though that is like peak service time. But they have done their bit. And I'm the last to leave. I'm fortunate enough I can afford to take a cab home. I live close by to Soho. I can take a cab home. I lock up. And this is fine. And my kids are like 20 and 15. There's some who are younger. And people are shocked that a lot of my team come in at 10 o'clock. But they've sent their kids off to school. If I left my kids, no one would even get up. They wouldn't have gone to school. It's just the practicalities of things. It's not rocket science. You just change the rota system. You have part-time work. You have women coming in shifts. We can do it. But no restaurant allows that purely because there is a continuity. No, there is. You're excluding women by not allowing us to have, and also damaging men. The mental health of men who are like completely, crazy people sitting in the dark working 16-hour shifts. And then all this tension boils up, and the lack of communication means that they often hit out physically. Sometimes it is sexual, in frustration. And even if you were the CEO of a huge company, in the end you would not get away with it. Somehow in our restaurants, in our restaurant kitchens, men are being allowed to use the argument about stress to physically assault women, and we take it.
Is it happening a lot?
Yes, it's happening a lot. 9 out of 10, they just recently did a survey, 9 out of 10 people across restaurants said they had been either victims of bullying or had seen bullying. And the problem is that for the men who bully, I tell them, and this is like, it's a hot place, it is, the extractor is quite loud. There's this kind of constant sound of the extractor. There's a lot of pressure because you have all these tables. If you can't deal with the pressure, get the hell out of the kitchen. This is not the place for you. You do not have the right to abuse and assault a woman or a weaker person, because sometimes in kitchens, a lot of kids who don't do really well in normal schools are often sent off into kind of vocational training, and they take up cookery. So the person who is doing the worst job at the end of the kitchen, the person washing the pots, invariably black in London, they are there because they have actually not been able to get other jobs. It is tough for them. They're a bit slow. And I've talked to these young boys. The abuse they get, it saps, it drains their self-confidence. And I'm so angry. If you are powerful, this is not how you behave. Your power is about how you lift up other people. And I don't want to eat the food of a Michelin star kitchen if I know that behind that kitchen door there is there's toxic abuse of weaker people. And I've said this recently somewhere. I don't want restaurants to be ranked by Michelin stars. I want to be ranked by how they treat their staff. That is really important. Don't go to places where there is abuse. Do not eat in those places. Boycott places where there is abuse and where head chefs still keep their jobs after making comments, derogatory comments about women. They need to be sacked. Owners are responsible. Because this is a problem, that owners will get rid of the woman or the weaker male person working in the kitchen, but not their prima donna, their shining emperor, the chef. The emperor has no clothes. Someone has to say it. You have no right to be this powerful and see yourself as powerful if you abuse your power.
Right. So when nobody over here is going to eat at Heston Blumenthal's ever again, okay, that's...
Oh God, there's a risk he might just sue me now for whatever I said.
No, I'm calling for the boycott, you're not. So Anu, let's talk about this. Pregnant women cannot lift heavy pots. Women are weak and frail. And you spoke about this a short while ago and said women can do everything that men can do, if not better. And so let's talk a little bit about that in the military. And I also want to take it from what Asma said in terms of abuse, in terms of toxicity. And we are seeing a Me Too movement unfolding. And let's talk about the military and sexual harassment.
Yeah, so I love what Asma says. There's so many parallels. Women have always been strong. When men or women kind of have conversations about women's inherent physical weakness, I wonder about that. I've met so many physically strong women throughout my life. I don't know that.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's if you follow Anu on Instagram, there's a frightening video of her doing pull-ups, and it sent me to bed for a week when I saw it.
I grew up playing sports, and so I met, and I'm sort of on the smaller side of in terms of my height and my weight, but I grew up with women who were, all-American athletes and playing rugby internationally and basketball. I mean, I've just met phenomenally physically strong women and girls. This is and this is around the world, not just in the U.S. And so it strikes me as curious when men have never met a strong woman. I mean, all of their mothers are incredibly strong. I don't know if they realize this, but like pregnancy is not for the weak either. But pregnant women are not weak. They're doing a lot of physical work during those 9 months and certainly afterwards on no sleep. So, but in the military, which is an incredibly physical job, I constantly trained my Marines. I was an officer, and so I was in charge of hundreds of younger Marines and older Marines, but they just were not used to this idea that you set a single standard, a single physical standard for all of the tasks in your unit, and then you train your people to achieve that standard. So a woman is trained to do the exact same job as a man. And that means going to the gym regularly, just like the men do. I mean, this is just common sense. Women are phenomenal athletes, but if you are not an athlete, you will never be strong in that way if you don't train, right? So you're not born being able to do pull-ups, right? So you train to do pull-ups. You train to lift hundreds of pounds. Women are capable of doing that. We've certainly seen that when we opened up the assignments. But you were describing the scenes in the restaurants, and it's so familiar, that kind of like physical, intense, brutal work. I spent actually a year in the restaurant world, and so I know this. I have a lot of respect for what you do. But it's a lot like that in the military, and powerful people abusing subordinates is a similar story across all institutions, and we certainly saw that in the military. And so one of the main things I did both in the military and then when I left was try and stick up for women who were being sexually harassed and assaulted. And all of these cases were swept under the rug by senior officers who were complicit. They just wanted to protect these sexual predators. And I thought, how, when you talk about, whether they're celebrity chefs like Mario Batali, right, or they're generals who are considered heroic, or they're war heroes, they've done something physically heroic on the battlefield, but then behind closed doors, they're raping, assaulting, or harassing their fellow servicewomen or local civilian women and girls. How is that heroic? How can you can't call somebody a hero if that's what they do in their lives. And so I've been challenging the way we define heroism in the U.S. military.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Am I allowed to ask a question? I want to know that, when you were arguing and supporting women being harassed, did the men in the military stand by you? Did you have, was it mainly only women who were actually supporting you? What was the response of men in the military to the work that you were doing?
Oftentimes it was the enlisted Marines who were men who supported women, right? So sometimes it was a power dynamic, right? So it's a very classist system in the military. You have, if you have a college degree, you're allowed to become an officer. If you don't, then you are taking orders as an enlisted, sort of on-the-ground Marine. When women were being harassed in my unit, they were enlisted, they were sergeants, and they were phenomenally strong and, capable of leadership. They inspired the hell out of these male infantry Marines. They were the guys were really surprised by these women at what they could do. When they were being sexually harassed in my unit by a celebrated war hero, male officer, infantry officer, the enlisted guys came to their support. But it required that I step forward with my privilege as an officer to say, we're going to do something about this. I'm going to risk my career to stick up for these women. I'm going to file an independent investigation, go around the colonel's back because he's sweeping this situation under the rug. So you have my support as the female officer. There has to be some skin in the game, so to speak, right? You can't just expect that this is going to be easy. And that's the unfortunate thing. When you're a victim of harassment or assault, then there's so much pressure on you to step forward. So you need allies. So I would act as an ally for less powerful Marines, whether they were women or men, and it's absolutely necessary. And then their fellow Marines stuck up for them, and those Marines were men who stuck up for them, right? So
that's great to know, because again, the military is governed by these these inexplicable honor codes where if you speak up against a fellow officer, even if he is raping you and abusing you, you are seen as letting down the side. And that happens in a lot of militaries. That happens in government too.
Yes. So, Namita, I wanted to talk about pre-Nirbhaya days. And, as working with the NGO, we had gone to various government offices and we were talking about sexual harassment. And what we really needed to address at that point of time, and I think that continues, is the denial from men, particularly the men, about the existence of sexual harassment and its repercussions. So in this case, I remember this was an officer, a a fairly senior officer. And he said, but madam, हमारे government में तो कभी ये सब नहीं होता, ये private sector में होता है.
It doesn't happen in government, it happens in the private sector.
In the private sector. And now, post-Nirbhaya, I've also been appointed by the ministry on the sexual harassment committee. And I can tell you there were several, all the seniors, officers were women. And of course, there were the men also as part of that whole committee. But there was not a single time where we were actually called to discuss issues of sexual harassment or the measures which need to be introduced within the office to prevent these things happening. And therefore, I think, in a way, it's a comment about adding certain legislature, which is what has happened. This became mandatory post-Nirbhaya to have, the sexual harassment committee in all the government offices. And you had to have, certain mandatory things where you had somebody from the NGO as a part of that particular committee. But if you don't have those meetings, if you don't have a discussion about it, where are we going to have any effective results coming out from whatever legislature you can come up with? And therefore, I always attribute the violence, the rising violence in India, that, the laws are there. But unless there's sensitization, gender sensitization, unless our young men become a part of the discourse, these things will continue, and every time something like this hits you in the headlines, in the newspapers, and you say, oh, but what is happening? We have introduced this. Why aren't people, being put behind bars? We have politicians who go scot-free. So what do you expect?
Right. I know we're running short of time. I can't believe how fast it's gone by. Very quickly, Namita, we have the laws. Yet 96% of the women who work in India work in the informal sector. And when you had this whole Me Too movement, we did not hear any voices from factories, from farms. How do we break that silence?
Yeah, there are a lot of institutions which are taking up the cause of farmers and agricultural laborers, because they are always at the mercy of the owners, the landowners, as well as the money lenders. But there is another kind of violence which I want to quickly bring up, which is the women manual scavengers. Because a lot of manual scavenging still happens in India.
I hope everybody knows what manual scavenging is.
Basically, there are tens or thousands of women who have to physically clean up dry latrines, and they don't have...
Shit, yeah.
Basically, you are taking a lot of shit from men all the time, and this is like literally that. And they don't have even devices, they don't have masks. They have to just use their hands and brooms to do this. And I think that's a form of extreme violence.
It is, absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to open this for questions. Can we get the mics out in advance so that we don't waste? Here, the lady in front, and there's a lady at the back. If you could just get the mic at the back. Short question, please, and let us know who it is addressed to. Give us your name. She needs a mic. Kriti?
Kriti, yes.
Yes, hi.
Thank you all, first of all. That was absolutely inspirational. I recently watched a documentary about women runners in India. It's called Limitless on Netflix. And I just wanted to ask anybody, really, who wants to speak on this, about women having to feel like we're constantly feeling appreciative about the time given away from work when we have to take care of kids, etc. If you could speak on any different level in your own experiences of this whole feeling of being appreciative of the opportunities that are basically our rights. So when we're given, for instance, a woman was given an example that when she gets time away from her kids, she's very, very thankful to her husband, even though when he goes to the gym at 7 p.m., it's an expectation that he deserves that time.
Well, Asma has 2 kids, so I'm going to let her answer that.
So I think that this is a huge problem in our society, and the thing is that we haven't progressed that much in the West either. So a lot of my friends, it is not just an Eastern problem or a Western problem. I don't know whether it's in the female DNA that we have not learned that we have equal rights. We were not born to crawl through life. And I do not have the permission of anyone on what I do. I breathe, I live, because this is my right. But I don't know why this is happening in the West and the East.
Ma'am, your name?
My name is Pranjali, and good morning. First of all, I would like to appreciate the work Pari Network does. I really follow them. And my question is to Namita ma'am. I want to ask that since we can see an increasing capitalist growing economy nowadays, especially in a country like India, so I want to ask that how can we as individuals encourage women who do not want to who want to do some talented work, like they want to write something, they want to perform something, they want to go into the art sector. How can they be encouraged as individuals?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of websites that encourage women artists based on their names. But also, I would like to tell you that on Pari, we encourage women to write and to write about other women. One of the reporters we have is a first-generation educated person from her family. She's from a family of Adivasis. We also have a lot of women who are Adivasis who've been taught photography, and they give their work to be published on Pari. So there is a way to encourage different people around you, and there are many avenues where they can publish their work.
And just, if I could just add to that, if you like Pari's work, Pari has spawned a lot of other women-led rural networks, including Khabar Lahariya, which works out of Chitrakuta. They're fantastic reporters.
Hi, I'm Shelly. So to pick up directly from the talk, there was a quote that said that, like, women say that my household work makes me feel like someone. And I feel like there's a sort of sentimental burden on women to sort of give unconditionally, whereas that same expectation is not from men, right? So how do we sort of unwire that and try to detach that from women, that thing to give unconditionally is always with women but not with men? So how do we sort of wire and condition our men to do the same?
Give unconditionally at home,
yeah,
not at work, obviously.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to normalize the idea of men being active fathers in their children's lives, right? So this is in the West and the East. It should not be seen as particularly special that a man takes time off from work to be at home, change the diapers, cook for his family. This needs to be normalized. And it's a great honor, I think, to be able to spend time with your child, whether you're a mother or a father. These are precious times in the life of a parent. And some of this has to be institutionalized in law. There has to be not just maternal leave, but paternal leave. This has to be regardless of gender, right? We have to encourage men to be involved in child rearing, and it has to be across all society.
Absolutely. So I'm going to fix the gender balance in this audience question. I'm really very sorry, but I see a male hand going up. So he gets this question. Will you be around after this to answer questions? So I know we're out of time, just very quickly, but we will be around. So please do come up, introduce yourselves, and, they're very, very wonderful women. They'll be happy to chat. Please, your name, sir.
My name is Kevin Shah, and thank you for handing me the mic. I really feel equal today.
Welcome.
It's a male question. When the Titanic actually went down, it is true that men held guns and said that women and children only. And this was not an instance of just, holding doors or pulling chairs. This was life and death. If Titanic was to happen today, do you think that men would respond the same way, or would they feed them to the sharks below? Have the women stepped down to equality from a higher position up there at some level at some time in life?
That's a wonderful question. And my answer to that is, you would have also have read, besides the women and the children being asked, it was also those who were in first class. They were the ones who were supposed to go first. So the men rule economics all the time. And they decide, okay, who's going to go first? And therefore, we hope it'll be a more equal world from now on. And we don't want to have Titanics, though. Okay.
Okay, we are out of time. Please do ask your question. We're right here, and I'd love to hear from you. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that wonderful session. I want to thank our inspiring panelists, Anuradha Bhagwati, Asma Khan, Amita Nigam Sahaya, Namita Waikar, and Namita Bhandare. Wonderful, wonderful session.
A big thank you to JLF for creating these spaces for women. Please continue doing so. And the US Embassy for sponsoring this.
Exactly. A very big thank you.
And everybody for coming to listen.
Very big thank you to the US Embassy, to the North India office, New Delhi, for sponsoring this amazing series, Raising Women's Voices. Thank you all. Very quickly, before you all leave, I'd like you to check. It's time for a bit of fun. I'd like you to check to see if there is a Zomato sticker on the back of your seat. If there is, you can come up and claim your prize, your giveaway from Zomato. It's a lovely hamper. Yes, please come.